You ready to sell your hides?
No. I'm waiting for the stage. I want to get St. Louis pricing.
All right. You'll have your cash before supper.
July the year 1871. A train of wagons with North American pioneers moving through the Black Hills and the vast plains of Montana, heading to the west for a better future in the land of promise. The beauty of the sunset and the scenery around them filled their hearts with joy, and the immigrants had no thought of any danger or misgivings about the Sioux Indians who live in the area, for their fears had been all dispersed by constantly received assurances of their friendliness. Slowly their wagons wound through the timber that skirted a river called the Little Box Elder, and crossing the stream they ascended the opposite bank when unexpected without a sound of preparation or a word of warning, 250 Indians appear, painted and equipped for war, firing a single volley of guns and revolvers into the air. Suddenly the main body halted and sent out a part of their force which circled them around at some distance from the wagons. The leader of the surrounded immigrants advanced to meet the Indian chief and demanded his intentions. The chief immediately came towards him, riding forward and uttering the words, "Ho ho," which are understood to mean a friendly salutation. He assured them of his utmost friendship for the white people, then he shook hands and his band followed his example, crowding around their wagons. The Indians then asked for provisions and they gave them what they wanted. Nevertheless, they grew bolder and more insolent in their advances. One of them laid hold of the pioneers' leader's gun, but being repulsed, desisted. The chief at last intimated that he desired the immigrants to proceed on their way. Promising that they should not be molested, they obeyed without trusting them, and soon the train was again in motion. The leader of the pioneers saw that they were approaching a rocky glen, in whose gloomy depths he anticipated a murderous attack, and from which escape would be utterly impossible. The Indians urged them still forward, but the pioneers resolutely refused to stir. The Sioux Indians then requested that the travelers should prepare supper, which they said they would share with them, and then go to the hills to sleep. The pioneers concluded it's best to give them the feast, so the leader ordered 2 colored servants to prepare food and make a feast for the Indians. The 2 colored men had been slaves among the Cherokees and knew the Indian character by experience. Their fear and horror of them was unbounded, and their terror seemed pitiable. Each man was busy preparing the supper. Some were making the fire, others were getting provisions out of the wagons, a man was out some distance gathering wood. Some were distributing sugar amongst the Indians, when suddenly they threw off their masks and displayed their truly terrible intentions. There was a simultaneous discharge of arms, and when the cloud of smoke cleared away, there was a scene with a sickening horror. You could see scattered corpses laying on the ground, pierced by many arrows and bullets, Indians on wagons, tearing off covers, breaking, crushing and smashing all hindrances to plunder, breaking open locks, trunks and boxes, and distributing and destroying goods with great rapidity, using their tomahawks to pry open boxes, which they split up in recklessness. Some of the pioneer men fled and survived by hiding between tall grass and sagebrush where they concealed themselves, favored by the fast approaching darkness. The women and children who were in the wagon were taken captive, for it was a custom of the Indians sometimes to spare the lives of white women and children for ransom. Fanny Wiggins was one of those women that was captured by the Sioux Indians, and later wrote about her experiences in her book called Narrative of My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians. Terror of the most appalling nature for the fate of the captive children possessed Fanny Wiggins. and all the horrors of Indian captivity that she had ever heard crowded on her mind. The slow fires, the pitiless knife, the poisoned arrows, the torture of famine, and the thousand nameless phantoms of agony passed before her troubled soul, filling her with fear so harrowing that the pangs of disillusion compared to them must have been relief. The first indication the captives had that immediate massacre was not intended was a few articles of clothing presented by a young Indian whose name was Vekala, who intimated that they would have need for them. Vekala brought also a pair of shoes and a pair of little Marys. He looked kindly as he laid these articles before Vanny Wiggins, intimating by his gesture that their lives were to be spared, and that they should have need of them and other clothing during their long march into captivity. He also brought her books and letters, and all of which she thankfully received. She readily conceived the plan to make good use of them, and secreted as many as she could about her clothing. She was planning to drop the books and letters that she received at intervals along the way, so that their friends may find and follow them to their rescue, or if an opportunity of escape offer, they would seize it and by their help retrace their steps. The property that the Indians could not carry with them, they gathered into a pile and lighted. The light of the flames showed the forms of the captors busily loading their horses with plunder and preparing to depart. When their arrangements were completed, they came to the captives and signified that they must accompany them, pointing to the horses and motioning for them to mount. This was the first reliable assurance they gave them that their lives were not in immediate danger. Soon they saddled the horses for the captives and started on, leading them out the valley of Little Box Elder. Vanny Wiggins writes about the moment they left the valley and says, "Straining my eyes, I sought to penetrate the shadows of the woods where our fugitive friends might be hidden. The smoldering ruins of our property fell into ashes and the smoke faded away. Night had covered the traces of confusion and struggle with her shrouding mantle, and all seemed quiet and unbroken peace. I turned for a last look, and even the smoke was gone. The Solomon trees, the rippling water, the soft night wind and the starlight told no tales of the disillusion and death that had gone before, and I rode on in my helpless condition, with my child clinging to me, without guide or support, save my trust in God." Traveling northward and through tall weeds and bushes, they left the bottomlands and soon after came to a creek which was easily forded and where the Indians quenched their thirst. In the darkness of their ride, Vanny conceived a plan for the escape of her 7-year-old niece and adopted daughter Mary. Vanny whispered and told Mary that they were only a few miles from the camp, and the stream they have crossed she should easily wade through, and that she dropped letters on the way to guide their friends in the direction they have taken, and that they would guide her back again. Mary then dropped gently down and laid on the ground for a while to avoid being seen. Then she retraced her steps and fled. After a while, watching an opportunity, Vanny also slipped to the ground under the friendly cover of night, and the horse went on without its rider. Only this time, her plan would not be successful, for the horses betrayed her. Being frightened at her crouching form, they stopped and reared, thus informing the Indians of her hiding place. The Indians used great violence towards Vanny, assuring her that if any further attempts were made to escape, her punishment would be accordingly. They then promised to send a party out in search of the child when it became light. Marching deeper into the wilderness, the Indians took paths inaccessible to white men, and made their crossings at a point where it would be impossible for trains to pass, so that they might avoid meeting immigrants. The scenery through which the Indian passed was widely grand. It now became serenely beautiful, and to a lover of nature with a mind free from fear and anxiety, the whole picture would have been a dream of delight. They proceeded on the journey until near noon, when they halted in a valley not far to the north of Deer Creek Station. It was a clear and beautiful valley where they rested, until the scorching rays of the sun had faded in the horizon. The Indians were determined to go forward and they were soon mounted and started on. They traveled for days in exhaustion heat, marching through high, dry, barren lands and sandy hills until they reached a stream where they dismounted and camped. The stream by which the Indians camped was Powder River. Leaving Powder River, they passed through large pine forests and through valleys rich with beautiful grasses. Vanny Wiggins continued to drop papers by the way, hoping they might lead to her discovery, which would have proved fatal if anyone attempted a rescue, as the Indians preferred to kill their captives rather than to be forced to give them up. They marched further on through rocky mountains with transparent and noisy waters and fertile valleys, in which delicious wild fruits in great variety grows, till they reached a place called Crazy Woman's Fork. This country is scarred by countless trails of buffalo, so that what is often called the Indian Trail is merely the hoofprint of these animals. It was the 5th night of Vanny's journey with the Indians that she found herself under the weeping willows of Clear Creek. The Indian men who were tired were traveling, found a good camping ground and laid down to sleep, leaving a sufficient guard over their captives and at the outposts. After they've rested and recovered their strength at Clear Creek, they traveled through extremely difficult mountain passes and stopped at another camping ground where Vanny saw a possibility of escape. It was the 6th night. The way was far beyond her reckoning and the woods where they are might be infested with wild beasts. But the prospect of getting away and being free from the Indians closed her eyes to the terrors of starvation and ravenous animals. Softly she rose and attempted to slip towards some growing timber. But the watchful chief did not risk his prey so carelessly, and his iron hand grasped her wrist and drew her back. Throwing her fiercely on the ground, he threatened her, which she momentarily expected him to put into execution as she lay trembling at his feet. She could only cry to God for mercy and prepare to meet the death which had long hung over her head, when a young Blackfoot, whose name was Jumping Bear, saved her from the approaching doom by snatching the bow from the Indian and hurling it to the earth. The Indian submitted to his intervention so far that he did not draw his bow again, and her suspense was relieved for the time. The terrible heat of the days continued and the road they took was barren of water. The 7th night they entered the singular canyon, apparently well known to them, as they found horses there which evidently had been left on a former visit. The Indians had killed an antelope that day and they gave Vanny a piece of flesh for a meal. They then traveled in a circuitous route for miles to reach the mouth of this canyon, and entered it just after sundown, arriving at the spot they selected as a camping ground. Vanny Wiggins writes about the ambience at the encampment and says, "They made fires whose fantastic gleams danced upon the rocky walls and added magic splendor to their wondrous treasury. The ghostly grandeur of these unfrequented shades cannot be described, but their effect is marvelous. They seem to shadow forth the outline of carving and sculpture, and in the uncertain firelight have all the effect of some old-time temple, whose art and glory will live forever, even when its classic stones are dust. Here I found water for my parched lips, which was more grateful to my weary senses than any natural phenomenon. And sinking on a moss-grown rock, near the trickling rill that sunk away in the sand beyond, I found slumber in that strange, fantastic solitude."
What happened?
Chased down here by hired piece.
Oof! White men dressed up like Indians, war paint, feathers and all. Just a few minutes ago.
But I guess the stage must have scared them off.
A dark sky and great ragged masses of clouds hung low over the surrounding hills. The air grew heavy, relieved occasionally by a deep gust of wind that died away to be succeeded by an ominous calm. Low muttering thunder jarred painfully on the ears. The Indians, seeing the approaching storm, prepared for it by collecting and fastening their horses, and covering their firearms and ammunition, and lying flat on the earth themselves. On came the storm with startling velocity, and the dread artillery of heaven boomed overhead, followed closely by blinding flashes of light, and the velocity of the whirlwind seemed to arise in its might, to add desolation to the terrible scene. When the vivid gleams lit up the air, enormous trees could be seen bending under the fierceness of the blast, and great white sheets of water burst out of the clouds, as if intent on deluging the world. Every element in nature united in terrific warfare. The thunder roared and the wind ravaged ungovernable wild. The rain had already swelled a little creek into a mighty stream that rolled its dark, angry waters with fury, and added its sullen roar to the howlings of the storm. It took 3 long, never to be forgotten hours for the storm to fade. The flashing lightning and the roaring thunders gradually became less and less distinct to the eye and ear, and the devastating storm was speeding on towards the east. And when at dawn of day the waters were assuaged, the thunder died away, and the lightnings were chained in their cell, the scene was one of indescribable desolation. The wind had gone home, daylight had cowed him from a raging giant into a meek prisoner, and led him moaning to his cavern in the eastern hills. A strangely solemn calm seemed to take the place of the wild conflict, but the track of destruction was there, and the swollen water and felled trees, the scattered boughs and uprooted saplings, told the story of the havoc of the storm. It was a night of horror to pass through, but it was nothing compared to the fear that the captives had when they were approaching the Indian village, and where the fate of the captives would possibly be decided by bloodshed or the fearful stake. On the 21st of July, they left camp early and continued their journey. The day being cool and favorable for traveling, their route lay over rolling prairie, interspersed with extensive area of marsh, which however they easily avoided crossing. Jumping Bear, a young Indian who had shown Venny so many marks of goodwill, again made his appearance with a sad expression on his face, and that day would ride in silence by Venny's side, which was an act of great condescension on his part, for the Indian men rarely thus equalize themselves with women, but ride in advance. They had now traveled nearly 300 miles, and despite Venny's fears, she began to rejoice in the prospect of arriving among women. Even though they were Indians, she had a dawning hope that she might find companionship with beings of her own gender, however separated their lives and customs might be. While on her journey, Venny thought of all the characters of romance and history, wherein the nature of the red man is enshrined in poetic beauty, the unchartered nobility of soul, the brave generosity, the simple dignity untrammeled by the hollow conventionalities of civilized life, all rose mockingly before her, and the heroes of her youthful imagination passed through her mind in strange contrast with the flesh and blood realities into whose hands she had fallen. The stately Logan, the fearless Philip, the bold Black Hawk, the gentle Pocahontas, truly those pictures of the children of the forest that adorn the pages of the novelist, are delightful conceptions of the airy fancy, fitted to charm the mind. They amuse and beguile the hours they invest with their interests, but the true red man, as Venny saw him, does not exist between the pages of many volumes. They were now nearing a river which from its locality must have been the Tongue River, where they found a refreshing drink and rested for a short time. Here the Indians paused to dress and decorated themselves with clothing taken from the raided wagons, to make a good appearance and imposing entrance into the village where their families and friends awaited them. The Indians gave Veni to understand that when they crossed this stream and a short distance beyond, they would be at their home. When all was arranged, the chief mounted his horse and rode on in triumph toward the village. Highly elated over the position of his white captive, the entire Indian village poured forth to meet them in the most enthusiastic manner. There were flourishing flags and weapons of war in frenzied joy. As they entered the village, which stretched for miles along the banks of the stream, resembled a vast military encampment. They penetrated through the irregular settlement for over a mile, accompanied by the enthusiastic escort of men, women, and children. They rode in the center of a double column of Indians and directly in the rear of the chief, till they reached the door of his lodge, when several of his wives came out to meet him. He had 6, but the senior one remained in the tent, while a younger one was absent with the farmer or grass venture Indians. Their salutation is very much in the manner of the Mexicans. The women crossed their arms on the chief's breasts and smiled. When they met Veni, it was in silence but with looks of great astonishment. Veni got down off the horse as directed and followed the chief into a great tent, distinguished from the others by its superior ornaments. It was decorated with colored porcupine quills and a terrible fringe of human scalp locks, taken in battle from the ponies. The women of the chief's family seemed kindly disposed towards Veni, and one of them brought her a dish of meat. Many others followed her example, even from the neighboring lodges. They showed great evidences of compassion and tried to express their sympathy in signs, because she had been torn from her own people and compelled to come such a long fatiguing journey. At nightfall, an elder woman came to Veni. She built a fire and caused water to boil, and drew a tea of which she gave her a portion, assuring Veni that it would cure the tired and weary feeling, and secure her a good rest. This was proven to be true, for soon a deep drowsiness began to steal over Veni, and she slept sweetly. This was the first true sleep she had enjoyed in many nights. The next morning, the whole village was in motion. The warriors were going to battle against the white enemy, and old men, women, and children were sent out in another direction to a place of safety, as designated by the chief. Everything was soon moving. With the rapidity of custom, the tent poles were lowered and the tents rolled up. The cooking utensils were put together and laid on cross beams connecting the lower ends of the poles as they trail the ground from the horses' sides, to which they are attached. The train of the Indians was immensely large, nearly the whole Sioux nation having concentrated there for the purpose of war. The chief's sisters brought Veni a horse saddled and told Veni to mount and accompany the already moving column, that seems to be spreading far over the hills to the north. Late in the afternoon they arrived at the ground of the encampment and rested for further orders from the warriors, who had gone to battle and would join them later. Veni had no means of informing herself at that time with whom the war was raging, but afterwards learned that General Sully's army was pursuing the Sioux, and that the engagement was with his men. Within 3 days the Indian warriors returned to camp, and entered on a course of feasting and rejoicing. This caused Veni to believe that they had suffered very little loss in the battle, and soon again they were making preparations for another battle. Only this time, the action seemed to draw ominously near the encampment. There seemed to be great commotion and great anxiety in the movements of the Indians, and presently, Veni could hear the sound of battle. And the echoes that came back to her from the reports of the guns in the distant hills warned her of the near approach of her own people, and her heart became a prey to wildly conflicting emotions, as the Indians hurried on in great desperation, and even forbid Veni turning her head and looking in the direction of the battle. Once she broke the rule and was severely punished for it, they kept their eyes upon Veni and were very cross and unkind. Hoping for rescue, yet fearing for its accomplishment, she passed the day. The smoke of action now rose over the hills beyond. The Indians now realized their danger and hurried on in great consternation. General Sully's soldiers appeared in close proximity, and Veni could see them charging on the Indians, who, according to their habits of warfare, skulked behind trees, sending their bullets and arrows vigorously forward into the enemy's ranks. Veni was kept in advance of the moving column of women and children, who were hurrying on, crying and famishing for water, trying to keep out of the line of firing. They had traveled far and fast all day long, without stopping, through clouds of smoke and dust, parched by a scorching sun. Veni's face was blistered from the burning rays, as she had been compelled to go with her head uncovered, after the fashion of all Indian women. The terrible scarcity of water and grass urged them forward, and General Sully's army in the rear gave them no rest. The following day or two they were driven so far ahead, and became so imminently imperiled by the pursuing forces, that they were obliged to leave all their earthly effects behind them, and swim the Yellowstone River for life. By this time, the ponies were completely famished, for want of food and water, so jaded that it was with great difficulty and hard blows that they could urge them on at all. When Indians are pursued closely, they manifest a desperate and reckless desire to save themselves, without regard to property or provisions. They throw away everything that will slow their escape, and all natural instinct seems lost in fear. The Indians had left in their compulsory haste immense quantities of plunder. They left even lodges standing, which proved immediate help, but in the end a terrible loss. One day was consumed in collecting and burning the Indian lodges, blankets and provisions, and that day was used advantageously by the Indians in getting beyond his reach. They travel constantly in time of war, ranging over vast tracts of country and prosecuting their battles or skirmishes with a quiet determination unknown to the whites. A few days' pursuit after Indians is generally enough to tire out the eagerness of the white men, as it is almost impossible to pursue the Indians through their own country with wagons and supplies for the army, and it is very difficult for American horses to traverse the barren rugged mountain passes, the Indians having every advantage in their own country and using their own mode of warfare. After the attack of General Sully was over, an Indian came to Veni with a letter to read, which he had taken from a soldier who was killed by him, and the letter had been found in his pocket. The letter stated that the topographical engineer was killed, and that General Sully's men had caught the Indians and cut their heads off, and stuck them up on poles. The soldier had written a friendly and kind letter to his people, but before it was mailed, he was numbered with the dead. As soon as the Indians were safe, and General Sully pursued them no longer, Veni lost all hopes for liberty. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified about our latest videos.